Good evening. You're listening to Christian Media Trust on South East Radio. My name is Jarlath Glynn and this programme is brought to you by Wexford County Council Library Service. 2020 marks the centenary of the War of Independence, and during the month of March this programme examined the War of Independence in County Wexford. This evening, we will concentrate on the historical sources available to give us a better understanding of that period. My guest this evening is Gráinne Doran, Archivist with Wexford County Council. Gráinne, you're very welcome to the programme.
Thank you very much, Jarlath.
To begin with, what does the work of an archivist entail?
Well, that is a loaded question in terms of a local authority archivist. Our work is very extensive, but I suppose first and foremost to say that Wexford County Archive is the official repository for the archives and records of local origin and of local government in County Wexford. But added to that, we also have a very extensive archive of collections of private origin, and I suppose the intention is that we would be a one-stop shop, if you like, for all aspects of Wexford life in the county, and that includes collections that we have of maritime origin. Also we have collections of estate papers, educational records such as primary school archives that we actively acquire, and also social records, so personal paper collections. We would have business collections then, and also collections that are businesses that are no longer in existence in the county, such as various breweries, various maltings, publicans, and many collections like that. And I suppose my job as a local authority archivist then is to preserve those collections, to catalogue them and to put them into the public domain then so that future generations can research.
In that very large collection, what archives do you have on the War of Independence?
Not as extensive a collection as we have on the 1916 period in County Wexford, but certainly a collection that is growing. And I suppose one of the main collections we have, and I use this as a good example of a typical collection that would have, not just political, but would also have the social element, the personal element of a family collection as well, and that is the Edward Rowe collection. Edward Rowe was born in Beggar Loftus, just outside New Ross, in 1901, and at the tender age of 16 he joined the Cushinstown Company of the South Wexford Brigade of the IRA.
Very young.
Very young indeed, yes, but that would have been the average age at the time as well for joining, and similarly in 1916 as well. But Edward was very active in the War of Independence, and towards the end of the war he was arrested by the Black and Tans and brought to Waterford Jail before being transferred to Kilworth Camp near Fermoy in County Cork. And in late 1921, along with 18 of his comrades in the hut that they occupied in the camp, they escaped to a spot outside the camp fence by digging a tunnel with some spoons. So you can imagine now how laborious that was. But Edward went on then. He was a rate collector with Wexford County Council for a number of years, and during the visit of JFK to New Ross in 1963, Edward represented his former comrades on the reception platform, and there's a photo in the archive of President Kennedy speaking, and just right behind him is Edward Rowe. And also interesting, in that collection we have a handwritten account of Edward's time in Kilworth Camp. That was told by his sister Mary Eliza and his brother Andrew, and they document the hardships that he endured at the time during his internment. And also in 1996, Edward's son Bill Rowe told of stories of his father that were recounted to him of Edward's time in the War of Independence. So it's a rather, it's a nice family collection.
Is that record, is that an audio record?
It is a transcription of a tape recording. We don't have the actual tape recording itself, but it's a true transcription of it, yes.
You have a number of other collections as well.
We do, yes. We have, I suppose, a number of handwritten permits that would have been issued during the martial law period, issued by the RIC to various individuals and to families for permission to use a bicycle or drive a car to a certain location, whether for business purposes or personal purposes. We've quite a few of those. But I suppose one of the more important documentary sources for the period is a minute book, a handwritten minute book documenting the activities of the GAA board in Ballykinlar camp. Ballykinlar was an internment camp. It had originally been used as a training camp by the Ulster Division training during the First World War, but was used as an internment camp then during the War of Independence.
And where did that record come from?
That record came from one of the volunteers from Enniscorthy who was imprisoned there during that time, as were a number of his comrades from Wexford as well. And I suppose that's why it's important, because a lot of them are recorded or mentioned in the minute book itself, but also it depicts the social gatherings and how the men's spirits were lifted as well, and how they trained, and the GAA team was set up there, or two teams within the camp as well. And it also there is a letter, I think, to the secretary of the GAA in Croke Park regarding Ballykinlar's application for the presentation of medals, and it's and also a letter from the Commandant of Spike Island to the Commandant of Ballykinlar asking for a match to be played at some stage between themselves and the men in the Curragh. So quite an unusual document in its own right, but very interesting nonetheless. And also in that collection are a number of money tokens, and they would have been hand-painted cardboard currency, if you like, that was used in the camp during 1920 until the release of the men in late 1921. And there were a number of denominations of those, 1 penny being the most popular.
You mentioned there about the RIC administrative records. Where are they, or what do they tell us? Are they available, or what do they tell us about individuals?
Well, the RIC records are, I suppose, they comprise mainly the service records and also the pension records of the various officers, and they would cover the period 1816 to 1922. Now, they are available from the National Archives in Kew. So that, and the website for that, if anybody wants to access them, is nationalarchives.gov.uk. But also some of the pension records, or service records, I should say, of the men are available on Find My Past as well. I think they have digitised them and they're available there as well.
We'll come to the pension records a little later on. As well as the manuscript sources, do you have any artefacts from the period?
We have quite a number of artefacts, and I suppose that's where a local authority archive, or certainly Wexford County Archive, is different to a lot of other local authority archives in that we acquire quite a number of artefacts as well. Usually an archive would be associated with documentary material, but some of the artefacts from the War of Independence period, well, I suppose some of the more unusual ones would be the mascot, a bear that was off the front of a British black and tan Crossley tender that was stationed in Enniscorthy in 1920.
For the benefit of our listeners, a tender is?
A tender is a vehicle.
Right.
A motorised vehicle that would have been used at the time. Also, we have portion of the green cloth from a billiard table that was destroyed by members of the Devonshire Regiment. The Devonshire Regiment would have been stationed at the courthouse in Enniscorthy during 20 and 21, and they raided the Irish National Foresters Hall in Court Street in 1920. And as they were searching for arms and ammunition, and the men that were there were searched, nothing was found, and they came back later, I suppose, to cause more havoc, but there were no men there at the time, and in frustration they destroyed the billiard table. So it's a sort of an unusual artefact in its own right, but also indicative of the time, and from 1916 to 23, during the time that men and women were interned. We have beautiful pieces of prison craftwork. So they would have been the likes of Celtic crosses and Irish harps fashioned from the bones of animals, from the hip of a cow, for example, and also a lot of jewellery, brooches, rings that would have been melted down from coins.
You have a lot of material. What material would you like to have? Or what would you like the public to donate to your archive?
Well, I suppose first and foremost to acknowledge all those individuals and families that have come forward over the years, and particularly for the Decade of Centenaries as well. Without them and without their generosity, so little would be available for this important period for public research. But I suppose one thing for the War of Independence period that we are lacking are photographs of men and women. And I suppose we'll be talking about the pension records later, but just to say that a lot of men, and particularly women, didn't apply for a pension and would, they went undocumented as a result.
Why did they not apply for a pension?
Well, I suppose some of the more diehard and the anti-treaty men and women, as the Cumann Mon and the IRA members, may have seen it as a ploy, from by the Free State government at the time, maybe to halt their activities if they were given a pension. But a lot of them didn't apply, so they have been sort of written out, if you like, out of the period, and that's where families come in, and I'm sure they have photographs. They may have letters written by their loved ones from prison, or alternatively given to them from others, and it's documents and material like that we would certainly be very interested in acquiring, just in building up a picture. When I say depositing is wonderful, and if people would like to hold on to their material, we will certainly digitise it and give it back to them as well. Yeah,
I saw a photograph recently of some of the survivors of the munitions explosion in Salt Mills, and I'm sure you'd be interested in having that.
Yes, certainly, yes.
The fatalities in County Wexford were not as high as in other counties such as Kerry or Cork or Dublin. There were 23 in all. There were 7 volunteer casualties. There were 6 RIC, and civilian deaths were 10. Now, maybe you could tell us a little bit about those figures?
Yes, well, certainly they were very low, as you say, in comparison to the main areas of activity, which would have been down in Cork and Kerry and Tipperary, of course, as well. In terms of County Wexford, the first casualty of the War of Independence of somebody from County Wexford was on the 12th of February 1920, and that was the shooting dead of Seamus O'Brien. Seamus O'Brien was an active Republican, and he was originally from Morris Castle, just outside Kilmuckridge. And he was interned during 1916 for his activities, and on his release he rejoined the Irish Volunteers, and he moved to Rathdrum, County Wicklow, where he opened a grocer's shop on the main street in the town with Sean Walsh. They had a successful business there for a short period, and on the evening of the 12th of February 1920, during a chase of the RIC, or by the RIC, of three men in the town, one of whom was alleged to have fired a shot at the RIC men, Seamus was inadvertently shot dead outside his premises. I mentioned Seamus. He was not only the first casualty, if you like, of the war, but also we have artefacts relating to him, and his plate and spoon are on display in the 1916 exhibition in the Athenaeum in Enniscorthy, and we were very fortunate to contact or to receive information relating to Seamus's relatives, because we hadn't been able to identify them up to now. And for for the centenary of his death on the 12th of February, just gone, his family, his granddaughter, deposited a large framed photograph of Seamus, which we copied, and that is now on display in the Athenaeum as well. And also his granddaughter inadvertently found two prison letters, two pieces of prison correspondence that were folded up and tucked away into the back of the frame, and she is hoping to deposit those in the archive shortly as well, and we will transcribe those and put them on display as well.
Probably the best known or well-known murder was of Percival Lee Wilson, a district inspector in the RIC in Gorey.
That's right.
What do we know about that?
Well, Captain Percival Lee Wilson was shot on the 15th of June 1920, and he had been in Gorey for about 3 years, and he had served previously in Jarlath, County Cork, and joined the British Army in 1915 and served in France, where he was promoted to captain. And during the 1916 Rising, he was in charge of a number of rebel prisoners in Rotunda Gardens in Dublin. And he was alleged to have mistreated them quite badly during that time. And as a reprisal, he was shot dead in Gorey.
There was one civilian death, I think it was a woman.
There were a number of civilian deaths during the period. The earliest one during the War of Independence was in February, I think it was the 14th of February 1920, and that was the shooting dead of Ellen Morris, who was a 61-year-old woman who was at home with her husband in the Balloch on that particular evening, and 6 armed raiders burst in and demanded to search the premises for ammunition and arms, and her 3 sons were out of the house at the time, but she defended herself as best she could, and she produced a large shovel from the kitchen and tried to ward them off, and she was shot dead by one of them. So she was the first civilian shot in County Wexford during the War of Independence. But there were a number, I think there were 9 others during the course of the period as well. And the inquests in relation to a lot of those were certainly quite detailed in the local newspapers of the time.
That was my next question. Most of the information is in the newspapers.
Certainly, yes.
Is it extensive?
It will be quite extensive, and I think in relation to Ellen Morris, she died in early February 1920, and it wasn't until, I think, July or August of that year that the perpetrators were named and brought to justice. So the newspapers of the time certainly provide a very useful secondary source, but also will flesh out, the various events of the period as well.
For people researching the revolutionary period, there is much material available online now.
There is indeed, yes.
And the Bureau of Military History, what is that, or what source is it?
Well, the Bureau of Military History is part of the Military Archives website, but what it was established in 1947 by the Minister of Defence at the time, Oscar Traynor. And it was really set up to assemble and to coordinate the amount of material that was available for the revolutionary period from the formation of the Irish Volunteers in November 1913 until the truce period on the 11th of July 1921.
Are the witness statements part of this?
The witness statements form a very important part of the Bureau of Military History, yes, and quite a number of them are by County Wexford men and women.
If you think that some of your family have been involved in the War of Independence, how much information, detailed information, is there?
Well, certainly in terms of the witness statements, they would be given by men and women, and the importance of them not just from that particular person's point of view, but the people that they would also mention, their comrades that they would also mention in the witness statements. So again, we're going back to the rank and file members of each of the organisations, of the Irish Citizen Army, the Cumann na mBan, the Irish Volunteers, the Irish Republican Army, na Fianna Éireann, that the rank and file members who otherwise might have gone undocumented, and they are mentioned quite extensively in the witness statements, and that was also a form of proof, if you like, for the pension records then as well.
And what's included in the pension records?
Well, the military service pension records are, I think it's one of the most important archival sources for the revolutionary period extending from 1913 to 1923. And I suppose they were set up to compensate and to recognise wounded members and the widows, children and dependents of members of the various organisations that I mentioned a few moments ago. So you would have detailed applications for pensions, and they're a very important form of social history in that regard, because you have, the letters, correspondence from verification officers who would verify that that man or that woman was, was active during that time, a testimonial from their commanding officer of the time as well, but also other supporting documentation and other series within the military pensions collection on the Military Archives website would include the medals, those that were awarded a medal posthumously, and also the various brigades, and you have a breakdown of the members of each of those as well. So from a family history point of view, they are extremely important, and most of the material is available on the Military Archives website. Of course, there are elements then of some of the pension records that might be too confidential or too personal at this time, and as for data protection purposes would be withdrawn, from public view. But certainly the families themselves would be able to access them in the reading room.
So the families do have control over what is made public?
The family, they would, yes, and they should, yes, certainly.
There's a photographic archive, is there? You mentioned photographs earlier.
There is a collection, I think it's around 400 photographs in the Bureau of Military History Archive, yes. Now they're mainly of national events as such, and centred a lot around Dublin. There is very few relating to County Wexford as such, but certainly an extensive range of them, and they are all digitised and available on the Military Archives website as well.
And what information do we have on the role of women in the War of Independence?
Well, women, I suppose, they kept the home fires burning while the men were incarcerated in the various prisons and internment camps after 1916. And they, I suppose, their responsibilities were quite extensive at the time, and they provided safe houses and supplies. They gathered intelligence, carried dispatches, provided medical attention. They acted as lookouts, hid weapons, and they distributed propaganda so that when the men came out of prison, they were there to reorganise, and they were in a position, that they could do so, and that without the input of women at the time. Now, when that said, some of the women were actually incarcerated for as long a time as well, and one of the women from County Wexford, Nell Ryan from Tom Cool, was one of the longest serving female prisoners during 1916 leading up to that time. She was imprisoned in a number of jails, Waterford and then in Kilmainham and in Mountjoy, with her friend, with her very good friend, Kathleen Brown from Rathronan Castle.
She was a historian, I think.
That's right, yes. Now, Kathleen was released from Mountjoy in early June of 1916, but Nell was, I suppose, because of the fact that she was a secretary of the County Wexford Insurance Board as well, and was seen to be an active revolutionary during the time, and was a member of Cumann na mBan as well, and she was detained until her release in October 1916.
So women did play a very important role in the War of Independence.
Oh, certainly they did, yes. And in terms of their identity and in terms of their activity during the period, certainly, again, the military archives, pension records are indispensable.
Thank you, Gráinne. I'm afraid we've run out of time. We could keep talking on this subject for a long time. I'd like to thank you and all my interviewees over the last 4 programmes, and I would like to thank you, the listeners.
This programme was produced by the Christian Media Trust, exclusively for South East Radio.